Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chief Architect Forum News. This week, we have something a little bit different. We'd like to talk about communication. Communication for architects is job number one. Our strongest power is the power of translation. And I mean across all layers, from code to the C-suite. And no matter how elegant your model or how scalable your stack, your influence stops where your communication skills stops. So we're going to try and explore how architects can elevate their impact, master communication, all the way from dev teams to the C-suite, and drawing some inspiration from a few language experts that Price has been working with and knows well, Dan O'Connor, Jefferson Fisher, trying to apply their playbook to the architect world. How you doing, Bryce?
Doing great. And before we get into that, though, I know you're in Denmark, and I have a question for you. There's some recent activity with drones and stuff. How are you doing there, Kevin, with that? Like, what's happening? And is this a Russian invasion, or is this like Skynet happening?
Good question, and the jury is out. Probably not anything that our audience maybe has heard of yet, but this just happened last night. I will say, there were those reports in Poland of a couple of Russian drones, like almost 20, I think. And Russia kind of said, oh, that was a mistake, and they flew off course. But then one or two or three were seen in like Estonia and Latvia. You'd have to be pretty far off course. There was 2 or 3 days ago at the major airport, the largest airport in Copenhagen, just outside of Copenhagen, Kastrup, where they had to close down flights for about 4 hours. And then last night, there was this coordinated, concerted, nationwide, it's not a huge nation, but across the mainland and the two largest islands, where multiple drones swarming around critical infrastructure, namely every airport, I believe, both commercial and military. Drones at night hovering over this military base about an hour from here where F-35s are parked. A base 20 minutes from my home here. It's unsettling. You have this, I'm sure, especially for our American and North American audiences, in Canada, you tend to think of the war in Ukraine as being really far away. And we kind of have allowed ourselves to do that as well. But when they're flying drones over your airports, it feels a little closer.
And, it's interesting as a technology, the drones really, because they're so small, and there's so many of them, there's, I think, some new challenges to warfare. I think they're calling it some sort of hybrid warfare right now in some of the reports, or hybrid attacks. And
And
I mean,
characterizing it as hybrid attacks, but these are not little toy drones. They were up to 2 meters in size, 6 feet.
But these are like the deluxe quality ones. Like, you can't get them on Amazon. You have to.
You're not getting them, at the local toy store. No. These were, large commercial, industrial, likely, some kind of government issue drones. There is talk of there had been registered a freighter, a tank ship, but of Russian origin, some strange registry. But apparently it's well known to likely be part of what they call the shadow fleet, Russia's shadow fleet. It's not military, but does it have a legitimate commercial purpose? Probably not. And it was winding its way through the waters around Denmark last night and probably launched these drones because they were all over the entire nation. Everyone had these between like 2 a.m. and 4 a.m.
Did you actually get to see any, Kevin, or did you just?
I did not. I've seen several people who took, live little video of it, but no, I was sleeping. And they chose not to down any of them. They did not shoot them down. They tracked them because they thought, number one, you shoot it down, what you shoot has to come down and it could fall. And does it fall on somebody's house or something? I mean, 6 by 6 feet, this is not a small thing falling on people's heads. So they didn't do that, and they wanted to track them to where they were going.
Yeah,
they have
sense.
not said anything more about what they found out. They're being fairly tight-lipped about it, but yes, big news. And of course, does Denmark's aging, weakened military defense machine have anti-drone capacity? No, it does not. Yeah.
I mean, well, look at what's happened with Poland. I mean, there was an incursion there recently.
Yeah,
you know what's happening here. I mean, these drones are fairly new. I think we're going to see something come out of it. I don't know what the defense would look like, whether it's going to be sort of an electromagnetic pulse that downs them or something, or more targeted, right? I think this is going to be a big item that we're going to have to deal with. Even actually, I think the October 7th started with drone attacks that were meant to, overwhelm the Iron Dome in Israel.
Sure.
And so this is becoming, I think, a new phase of warfare that we're going to have to deal with. And that's interesting, because the one takeaway from that is that the spending on conventional things like tanks, like guns, doesn't help us against drones.
No. No, it does not. Yeah. Yeah, and interestingly, I mean, if we assume that this was instigated by Russia, certainly could be a warning signal to the rest of NATO, because Denmark, as one of the first in NATO, went ahead about 2 weeks ago and approved to begin construction in, I believe, 2 cities of like drone factories, where they're just going to pump out drones and send them directly to Ukraine. It is to arm Ukrainians against Russia. And yeah, just after that's announced, this happens. So
Interesting.
I think it's a message, which is unsettling. I don't know what the response exactly should be, but it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Let's revisit that. In the meantime, let's talk a little bit towards good communication. And I think as architects,
absolutely,
we have different levels as we've gone through our career progression. Many architects, of course, have started as analysts, business developers. And at that level, good communication is really clear communication. It's about using meaning. I think as people progress, the next layer involves broader relationships like management. How do I deal with people? And it adds this thing on, I think, called emotions that we need to deal with in those discussions. How do I communicate ideas clearly and not get people too excited, and get things through to them, and deal with things like, people that don't agree with you, and getting around that and presenting your ideas. And I think as we go up, very, simply, you get to the highest level, which is the executive boardroom. And there you only have literally, seconds or minutes to make an impression.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to sort of start, go through some items here. So I think at the most basic level, precision and clarity of language is really important. And I'm just going to share, I've read some of the stuff from Jefferson Fisher. And of course, he has the YouTube videos. As an ex-trial attorney, I think he does some really great stuff, especially diffusing situations. So I really like his stuff there. And then the other expert that I followed, and I've taken his course, I think it's called Come Out of the Shadows or something, Dan O'Connor, the Wizard of Words. And his material is absolutely excellent. So what I'm going to do is we go through these, I'm going to just a couple points, and then we'll kind of bounce that, how that works. But I think at the most basic level, clarity of language is really important. So if we look at somebody like Dan O'Connor, what he would say is eliminate the jargon, speak clearly, and importantly, understand who your audience is. And this is very similar to what somebody like Jefferson Fisher would advocate. Especially in high stakes settings, it's important to cut through complexity, right? And speak clearly. So at a very basic level, what does that mean? And I'm just relating that to architecture training. We have this idea of views and viewpoints and concerns. And I think part of that is really understanding the person you're talking to and what their concerns are. And to me, that's clarity. What are your experiences with that, Kevin?
Yeah, I love that you're starting with clarity and mentioning, like, from complexity to clarity. I think that Dan O'Connor's focus on stripping away jargon is especially relevant when you apply this to architecture. We can certainly be nerds. We can drop too many three-letter acronyms. We can assume people know what we're talking about when we say something about, latency or mesh networks, or I don't know what. Um, People just don't know what these things are, number one. And number two, you're not speaking their language. You shouldn't even be talking about the technology. Speak CXO is what I tell people. Learn the language of business. I teams that I coach, I would always like go through their decks the day before the review, before we were going to be showing slides, and invariably, like some diagram that had, let's say 40 boxes and arrows. I'm like, okay, let's get down to about 7 boxes or arrows, number one. And number two, the title at the top that you're grabbing people's attention. You have about 6 seconds to get their attention or lose it. It cannot be the event-driven mesh design. No.
But that's one of the big challenges.
That slide needs to be reducing response time to improve customer experience. That's what people want to hear about.
Then and that's really tough.
How we do that.
And that's tough because we're talking to these people that are developers, right? A lot of us have to, if there's something we need to present, we need to communicate with the developers too. And guess what? If I'm talking to a developer, the language I use, I talk about APIs, I talk about, injection dependency and all sorts of coding things. But it's like I have to shift gears completely depending on my audience and really take a step to recognize that the audience is different. And it's interesting, even in the Bitterbock, as they go through it, they point out the need to understand the concerns, right? I think TOGAF, the Bitterbock, all these groups point out to really make sure you know who you're talking to and what they find interesting. So it's not a casual, to your point, it's not a casual like, oh, I'm just going to change my language. It's really about targeting your stakeholders, right? And to your point, how many slide decks have we gone into? Like, I remember, like you're bang on. I remember going into one thing to executive meeting, and one of the project managers had like 50 bullet points, like on one PowerPoint slide, and it's not going to go. In fact, probably 3 items, right? If you're presenting to somebody like that, is about all you're going to get through, not 50. And it's, you don't need all the technical details, right? To your point.
No. Yeah, leave them wanting more. Make them ask. That's fine. And the speaking in tech to techies is fine. You're speaking their language. But our superpower is translation. When you walk into the room with executive or business stakeholders, you have to translate into their language and use their language.
Absolutely. And this is the other part, is that sometimes in these discussions, they're not easy. And I think one of the key elements that works across the board is this idea of storytelling and being able to talk to people in terms of a story rather than just saying directly, here's what it is. And for some reason, I think we know what it is. I think storytelling appeals to the factual side as well as the emotional side. And it seems to get through at various levels. It seems to be a very effective approach. Have you found that, Kevin?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that it's very effective to have some kind of a framework. I mean, it can be as simple as, what's the issue? What's the point I want to make? How do I want to wrap this up? Or, this was the problem. This is what we did. This was the outcome. Like in an interview, the PAR stories, problem, application, response, or STAR method, whatever you want to do, the situation, the task, and the result. have some kind of narrative that you're telling. And if you can tell it like once upon a time, that's great. Start with a time reference, and that sort of sets people into the mode of like, oh, he's telling me a story. Definitely use that, because we're wired to hear and understand stories.
You've touched on another part, which is the framing of our language. And I think that's the other benefit from dealing with some of these people. I mean, Jefferson Fisher has a book out right now. I got it. It's really, I enjoyed a lot of the hints in there. Okay. Dan O'Connor, of course, really emphasizes this. If you get a chance to check out some of his YouTubes, Wizard of Words. But what they do is they'll often use a formula to present versus different ideas. And the value is that a lot of times we'll walk into difficult situations that might be emotionally charged, and people may have agendas. Like, that never happens, right? Where people are in a room with you and they want to shoot down an idea, and you need to deal with that and get things out and get people to listen in a non-threatening way. And it's interesting. I'm just going to share, one story that I found very interesting. In my training back in the days when I was a project manager with IBM, good communication, part of this was about going through points. And the course I took really emphasized, like, oh, somebody brings up a point, address the point and deal with it. And there's a certain value to that. On the flip side, if you have somebody that's a little bit more senior and they're not trying to really understand the points, but they want to sort of run through them and present their own approach and shut it down, responding point by point can be very difficult. You can make us look defensive, right? Yeah, and sure. So this is one of the things that, Dan O'Connor pointed out is, in some of his stuff, is that you want to use the language not to address it point by point, but there's words that we can use to shift the conversation. Somebody says, oh, you did this and this wrong and this wrong. And you could, one of the formulas is, oh, that may be the case. Here, let me present the real issue, though. And so we don't get dragged into it. And so part of these frameworks, I think, help us understand the nature and the dynamic of the communication with people in the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, framing and structure, is super important and keeps you on track as well.
And I think that relates to another point that both have brought up, and it's around, as architects, how do we want to be known as communicators? And I mean, there's no shortage of stories, Kevin, from the old days about the ivory tower pontificator architect that would lecture everybody rather than understand and share ideas. Does that person have a place anymore as an architect? I don't think so. What do you think, Kevin?
No, I think that's important to note. The aspects of your tone and your presence. Having some executive presence when you're in the boardroom is good, because it's confidence, not being cocky, just kind of calm but not passive. If you're showing up and talking like a partner, then it's not you asking or begging or pleading, we could do this, or maybe, it's just, here is what I see as the best path forward based on what we know. We're recommending this. You've done the thinking for them because you have.
Yes.
You're not asking to be heard. You just speak like you belong at the decision table.
And I think there's an element that we need to go in and not get. One of the hardest things I find, Kevin, is walking into a meeting. And as architects, I think this is emotionally, and I'll share this is one of my toughest things, is recognizing that we're with the cards that were dealt that day. And we have to talk to that situation, which may not be always ideal, but it's what we have, right? And I think what we have to do is maintain, if anybody's going to be calm in the room, it's the architect. We need to be calm, professional, and also recognize that we need to be, and I maybe call this humility, but we need to call it out for what it is so that we can communicate. If there's like, a problem, we need to bring it out, not hide things. We need to be open with communication, and we need to share the options. I think this is the other problem that people have, is they sometimes, as the old, we'll call them the pontificator, would often come, well, you need to do this. And that's not what we need to really do in many cases. It's really about presenting options to the stakeholders in their language and getting them to buy in on it so that we're empowering them to be part of that meeting, not just us running it through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, totally agree. And back to what you were saying about handling objections, I think, and not being defensive, but just routing the conversation back to what is the outcome? What's the strategic outcome that we're looking
Yes.
for here? So, I mean, try to justify remediating technical debt or spending more money on higher quality. What? You're going to spend money and I get what I still had before? Why are we spending so much on this? And, instead of defending it, great question. We've looked at the costs, but let's look at the cost of not doing it. Every objection is a door to
Yes.
to teaching, to giving insight, as long as you keep that door open.
And you raise a great point. There's always options in the discussion, whether it's to do something and not to do it, right? Or if you look at it, I think that's the other trap is where people come in and they maybe look at one solution rather than presenting that against the other solutions. We may have done that in our head, but I think we also need to percolate that forward into the group to make sure that if we have an executive meeting, they're aware of the options and what they mean, right? I mean, there may be different technical underpinnings. They don't care, but does it affect profitability as an approach and things like that? I think that those are great points.
Yeah, profitability, costs, absolutely. And if that's the way you can tell your story, that's a far better story to tell than, a spreadsheet, you know, or speaking in jargon, we're going to modernize the ERP interface. Well, how about like, a 12-month delay in this modernization cost us a $2 million contract because we couldn't integrate with the customer fast enough. If your architecture isn't living in a story, it's probably going to die in that spreadsheet.
So I'd like to leave on one question, and I'll send it to you, then I'll take a shot at it. What do we need as architects to get a seat at the table? And I'm talking the C-suite or the executive table. How do we get their respect? How do we get to the table? And I think what we know it's not kind of making up stuff and giving them a lot of details. What's your experience to getting to that table and then dealing with it when you're there?
I think what we need to focus on as architects is the way that we build the story, and how we tie it to outcomes that matter. I think if you are speaking not in tech jargon, but in business outcomes, and then you are making relationships, you're going to start working on something with someone and collaborating with them and have even a small win. When you have that win, communicate it broadly, trumpet it, be your own marketer, and communicate it in business outcome language. Tie every decision, every initiative, everything you do to a business goal or outcome. And then when you trumpet that, it will catch more people's attentions. You will build better relationships across further, other areas of the business, and the cycle will repeat and repeat and repeat. So you're using your translation superpower to let technology drive business outcomes. And then architecture starts getting associated with traction. And that's
Yes.
where it starts to become, that's where it starts to move the needle.
I love that advice. I'm just going to echo some of what you're saying. I think one of the things that was implicit in what you said, Kevin, I just want to bring out is the idea that even if you have a seat at the table, sometimes the communication is with the individuals at the table before you get to the table. And so there's two parts to that. It's not just, I'm going to go to the board. You better know the individuals. And it's very political, but I think in that real sense, from my experience, it really pays to know people and take the time to share it and make sure what you're doing is aligned with their needs, their viewpoints. And really, I think when I look at architecture, some people have went, well, why did you become an architect? And the crazy answer is I like working with people. not technology. And it is a people job, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, when you can connect it to decisions being made, talk risk, budget, impact, I mean, if you can speak in the language of the business, then architecture doesn't become a gate or not a set of diagrams. It becomes a lever. It's being used to move real decisions. It's how you scale influence. The most powerful tool in the architect's toolkit is not code or cloud migration or whatever the recent hype cycle is. It's language.
It's
It's
language, and
how you stop defending decisions and start shaping them.
it's language, and a lot of the material, a lot of the courses, like the fundamental courses from ISA, go through the importance of understanding the stakeholder. And there's also a lot of people that help us form those and craft those words into stories and conversations. And I think this is I hope this is useful for some of our listeners. And if you have any comments or experiences you want to share, please do that. We'd love to have a dialogue. Kevin, thank you as always. A great discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you, everyone out there. Thanks, Bryce.
Cheers.
Talk to you later.